Well, it is great to see everyone this morning. We have definitely a nice full house. Last week, if you were here, we saw in Habakkuk chapter 1, Habakkuk makes some very important, or asks some very important but difficult questions of God. Habakkuk asked, why does God allow injustice? He saw the Jewish nation and how they were sinning and how they were perverting the justice system, how they were worshiping idols, and he asked God, how can you let this happen? And of course, God gave him an answer he didn't like. God told him that he was going to raise up the Chaldeans to punish the Jews. And so then Habakkuk asked, why would God use the wicked to punish the righteous? Those wicked, evil Chaldeans, how could he use them to punish the Jews? And you know, we may ask similar difficult questions. We may look around the world and see the injustice, see the corruption, see the sin around us, and ask those very same questions. So today, as we continue in the book of Habakkuk, our sermon today is entitled, Stand and See. Now you might notice a trend. Last week was watch and see. This week is stand and see, and next week will be kneel and see. You see the theme of watching what God is doing. And in Habakkuk 2, God is going to answer Habakkuk's questions. And he's going to do so by first addressing the folly of arrogant greed. He's then going to go through and give 4 woes against the oppressors. And then finally, he's going to discuss the folly of idol worship. Now, while God doesn't directly say, okay, here's the direct, this is why I'm doing this thing, answer to Habakkuk's questions, which most of us might like, he does answer Habakkuk's questions by demonstrating that the evildoers will not win, no matter where or who they are. Now, let's jump in. And let's look at the folly of arrogant greed. Habakkuk chapter 2. And again we see Habakkuk says, I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart. And I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I'm reproved. You know, Habakkuk knows that he might have spoken impetuously, and he's ready to be corrected if God so chooses. Now, this is a great example for us, a great lesson for us. We need to ask those hard questions, but we also need to realize that we don't have all the answers, and that when we ask those hard questions, we might get hard answers, answers that may not make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside. But that's good, because God's word isn't about us feeling happy. It's about God making us holy. So then we reread verse 2 and 3. Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. A little bit of historical history here. Inscribing a message on stone tablets and placing them in the city center was a common way to make public announcements in that time period. Of course, a piece of papyrus or a piece of animal skin that you write on could easily be destroyed or washed away in the rain or whatnot. But a stone tablet, they would often take something soft like sandstone and they'd make their announcements on it and put it in the city center so that everyone's going to see it. And so God tells them, make this announcement in such a way that people are going to see it, and when they see it, they can run. He says, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it. For it will certainly come. It will not delay. So the vision isn't for right now. The time isn't immediate, but it is coming, he says. Now, what I want to draw out about this for us today is that God doesn't work on our time scale. We may want him to answer our questions right now. But he works in his time, not ours. Now we get the vision or the message that Habakkuk was to write down. He says, behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. So God starts to draw a parallel here between the proud and the righteous. And this is quite interesting because he doesn't say between the unrighteous and the righteous, does he? He says between the proud and the righteous. Well, the proud are unrighteous. He says, behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. His soul's not right. He's not right with God. Where the righteous, by comparison, are humble. Okay, the text doesn't directly state humble, but because he's contrasting the proud with the righteous, we can infer that the opposite of the proud is humble. Now you see how righteousness and humility go hand in hand, and arrogance and unrighteousness go hand in hand. Because those who are righteous, well, they'll humbly accept what God says, and they'll submit themselves to his will. But those who are proud or arrogant will say, no, I'm not going to do what God says. I know best because I'm that cool. So the righteous are humble, and the righteous also live by faith. This isn't the first time we've seen this in the scriptures, is it? We see this concept throughout Scripture, that the righteous live by faith. Now, does that mean that they blindly cover their eyes and, like the world says today, they have blind faith? No. The righteous live by faith because they see God's word, they see God's commands, and they trust that God knows what he's talking about. And so they do what God says because they trust God. That's what it means to live by faith. Now God goes on, and he continues to describe the proud. It says, furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all peoples. Now there's a lot contained in just that one verse. So the proud, well, he says they're given to wine. Now I know alcohol tends to be a controversial topic, but you see so often how, well, what does alcohol do? It lowers your inhibitions. It makes it so you can't make good decisions. And it is directly tied here then to being discontent. He says here, furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man so that he does not stay at home. Okay, now why did I put discontent up there when the text says does not stay at home? Well, why isn't he staying at home? No, because he's not content with what he has. Now, putting this in the context of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, they had a beautiful, lush land. But they weren't content with that. They didn't want to stay at home. Instead, they wanted to conquer their neighbors, and then conquer the next neighbors, and conquer the next neighbors after that. But this can also be applied in a more modern context by those who are discontent in their personal lives. I don't know if there's a device running. Could we silence it? Well, you think about someone who maybe gets involved in not being content at home in their marriage. And they might wander. They might look for fulfillment outside of their marriage. They're discontent. They don't stay at home. You think about someone who might be a thief, and rather than staying at home, they're seeking what they want elsewhere. They're discontent. But they also have unsatiable greed. He says he enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. They have unsatiable greed. You cannot have enough. The Chaldeans, each neighbor was not enough. They conquered the next nation and the next nation, and they couldn't be satisfied. Now, putting that in a more modern context, you think about greed of any sort. Greed for money. You can never have enough money, right? People that are greedy for money, well, they might have billions, but they want billions more. You think about people who are greedy for unhealthy or ungodly sexual relationships. Well, one affair is enough. They need more. You think about people who are greedy for land. Well, the one chunk of land next to them isn't enough. They need more. They have unsatiable greed. But also they view people as commodities. He says he also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all peoples. Now again, the Chaldeans, directly, they would take slaves. They would conquer a nation, and they would take those people and either use them as slaves themselves, or they'd sell them into slavery. But then that can also be applied more modern ways. Now, not necessarily talking about direct slavery, although that is still a problem in some parts of the world. But you think about maybe an unjust landlord who doesn't think about the well-being of their tenants, but is only interested in cranking up the rent prices so he can line his pockets. Or you think about a business owner who doesn't think about the welfare or safety of his employees, but is only thinking about how much money he can get out of them. Those who are proud, who are unrighteous, view people as commodities. Now you notice in this that God does not specify what people group the proud belong to. We know that he's condemning the Chaldeans, but really, arrogant greed is a sin no matter what group a person belongs to. And this is one of the interesting things about this message, is that most of the things that God calls out in chapter 2 of Habakkuk apply just as equally to the sinful Jews of Habakkuk's time, not just to the Chaldeans. So we see the folly of arrogant greed. Now God is going to pronounce 4 woes against oppressors. Habakkuk 2, verses 6 through 7. Now, as we go through these woes, we must ask ourselves if we fall into any of these categories. Now, that might sound like a harsh thing to say, but it's easy to look at other people. It's easy to point fingers and say, oh, well, that person needs to hear this, or this person over there needs to hear it. But we need to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, well, am I doing anything that might cause harm to others? The first woe is woe to him who increases what is not his. Habakkuk 2, verses 6 through 8. He says, will not all these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him? Okay, all of these is all those nations that he collects to himself and all the peoples that he gathers to himself. It says, woe to him who increases what is not his. For how long? And makes himself rich with loans. That little bit in the middle, for how long, appears to be a parenthetical statement by Habakkuk. As he's writing this down, woe to him who increases what is not his. And he's going, how long, God? How long are you going to let this happen? And makes himself rich with loans. Okay, well, here's the question. Is this saying that using loans makes us oppressors? Is that what he's saying? Because he says, woe to him who uses these loans. Well, no, that's not what he's saying, though loans are not always the wisest option. That's a discussion for a different day. But what is he talking about here? Well, with this statement, woe to him who increases what is not his and makes himself rich with loans, historically speaking, Babylon did not use loans to fund their conquest. They did not go to their neighbors and ask for a loan of money. Instead, what they did, they plundered their victims to fund their conquest. They would attack a neighbor, take their stuff, and then use that stuff to further their conquest. Now, God appears to be using loans sarcastically here, meaning they would be paying back the plunder that they stole. So they thought they were just taking this stuff and it was going to be permanently theirs, but God says, nah, it's yours temporarily, but it's going to be paid back whether you like it or not. And that's seen in the next verse, verse 7. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them. So those nations that Babylon was plundering, that they were borrowing from, as it were, well, Babylon would pay back the loans when they were plundered by their former victims. And as we look at history, that's what we see. We see as the Medes and Persians came to power, many of the former victims of Babylon flocked to their flag to support the overthrow of Babylon. The very people that Babylon plundered would turn around and plunder them. Now, what I want us to notice in this is that the position of the oppressor is never as secure as they think it is. You know, you look at modern day someone who in some way harms or oppresses others, and they think they're above the law. They think that nothing they do is going to come back on them. They think that they're, higher than all of that. Whether it be a abusive husband or whether it be a despot in government. They think they're above getting caught. But their position is never as secure as they think it is. God says, because you have looted many nations, all the remainder of the peoples will loot you. Because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, the town, and all its inhabitants. So we have here God's charges against the oppressors. The looting of many nations. Obviously, that's what Babylon did. Human bloodshed. So they killed people without reason. Violence done to the land as well. Now this is interesting. Part of God's condemnation against them is that they destroyed the land. And the Babylonians, well, they were kind of vindictive. When people opposed them, they wouldn't just kill the people. They would make a point by destroying the land. They'd cut down trees. They would salt the farmlands, which means literally the soldiers would walk across the fields throwing out salt, thus destroying that plot of land's ability to grow food. So they would not only hurt the people, they would do violence against the land. But also then it says violence done to the inhabitants of the land. Now, some have looked at this and said it's just Hebrew duplicates of doing something twice to reinforce it. But you also see the idea that they weren't just killing people. They weren't just murdering the inhabitants of the land. They were also taking slaves. They were raping and pillaging. They were selling people into hard labor. So they were doing violence against the people, even if they didn't full-on kill the people. Now, God is being very clear about the reason for their punishment. There's no question about why they're being punished. Now, that would have been very comforting to Habakkuk. Why would you let these evil people get away with this? And he's telling Habakkuk they're not going to get away with it. But it's not going to happen in the time frame you might like. Now, the second woe is woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, verses 9 through 11. And God says, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. Now, this is kind of an interesting way to look at this. See, Babylon was seeking their own security, but they were seeking their own security by harming others. Rather than just saying, hey, we're going to get good relations with our neighbors and we're going to keep ourselves safe, they said the only path to security is to destroy everybody else. Now, seeking safety and security are good things. It's good to seek security for your community. It's good to seek security and safety for your family and yourself. However, harming others to secure safety for yourself is evil. If you have to harm others, hey, in order for me to be safe, I have to burn down all the houses around. I know that's an extreme example, but you see where I'm going with this. If our security is gained through harming others, well, that's not something we should be doing. He goes on, he says, you have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples. So you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stones will cry out from the wall, and the rafters will answer it from the framework. He reiterates that harming others to secure safety for yourself is shameful. Now, that's an interesting word, shameful. Our society doesn't like the idea of shame. Our society tries to tell us that you should never feel shamed about anything. But biblically speaking, shame is a useful tool that God built into us. That we want to avoid certain actions because it makes us feel ashamed. Now, why is it shameful? Well, it's a sin against others. It's a sin against God. But it's also a sin against yourself. Harming others to secure safety for yourself is shameful because it's a sin against everyone. Now he goes on to the third woe. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed. Verses 12 through 14. He says, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. So Babylon quite literally was building cities with slave labor, then putting those slaves to death. And can you imagine the hopelessness of that situation? You've been taken from your home by the invaders, forced to build these cities under intensely bad conditions, and then rather than getting to live in what you built, you're put to death. Now, again, building cities and increasing industry are good goals. It's good to do that. It's good to want to own a business and increase the economy of your local town. However, doing so with bloodshed and violence is evil. Now, we could make modern application of this when we talk about, again, like work conditions. Say you're a business owner. Well, it's good to build your business. That's a good thing. But if you're doing so by harming your employees, unsafe work conditions, or swindling them out of their wages, that's wrong. That's not good. He goes on, he says, is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire, and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Now this particular verse seemed kind of juxtaposed with some of the things around it. What is this talking about? The people toiling for fire is from the Lord. Well, after studying through this, what we see in this is that when people are not serving God, they're toiling for things that will not last. God has given us an industrious spirit. We want to be busy and to work. But if we're not working for Him, we're working for nothing. We're working for things that will just disappear. See, the only thing that will truly last is His kingdom and His righteousness. So whatever we do, we should be striving for His kingdom and His righteousness. That's what truly lasts. Now we've come to the fourth woe, and that is woe to him who makes his neighbors drunk. Verses 15 through 17. He says, woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. Now, Babylon as a nation may not have necessarily been making other nations get drunk, but the imagery here is clear that Babylon was using deceit, manipulation, and coercion to take advantage of other nations. And we see that when we study how Babylon dealt with Israel. That they would make promises that they were going to break, they would tell lies, they would try to coerce them into capitulating. Just like a predator will use alcohol to take advantage of others. A predator will intentionally get someone drunk. We've all seen that in movies or heard about it in real life, where someone gets another person drunk so they can get a better deal on a business dealing, or so they can take advantage of them sexually. That is evil. It's wrong. Now, as a side note, the best way to avoid that is don't drink alcohol. You're not going to get drunk and be taken advantage of in that way if you don't drink alcohol. That's a lesson for another day. He goes on, he says, you will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourselves drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. You see, Babylon would fall prey to the very same tactics they used against others. And it's interesting just how literally this came about. When you think about the Feast of Belshazzar, where the writing on the wall wrote from God, and how Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was partying and getting drunk while the city was under siege by the Medes and the Persians. And his downfall came directly from that. You see, falling into the hands of God is terrifying for those who oppose Him. And again, this phrasing is so interesting because for those who are righteous, those who are following God, those who are humbly bowing to Him, falling into the hands of God is a comforting thing. But for those who are opposing Him, falling into the hands of the living God is terrifying. Now he goes on and he explains, for the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the towns, and all its inhabitants. So God specifically calls out what the Babylonians did to Lebanon. Lebanon was once lush and beautiful. However, the Babylonians pointlessly decimated it. If you remember, in the Bible, it talks about how the cedars of Lebanon were absolutely beautiful, and they used these enormous cedars to build parts of the temple and King David's palaces and all these things. They were enormous and beautiful. But Babylon, they destroyed the land such that it still hasn't recovered today. They were cutting down the trees and just left them to rot. They didn't ship them back to Babylon to use them for something. They cut them down and let them rot. They killed the animals for sport, not eating the meat, but they were just killing the animals to leave them lie. And they were destroying the people in their towns just out of spite, not to repopulate them or to take slaves, but just decimating the towns just for the sake of it. In fact, Lebanon still hasn't recovered. You look at pictures of Lebanon now, and there is one small grove of cedar trees that are basically a national treasure for that region, and they have walls built around them so that no pests can get in, because that's all that's left of those great trees from all those years ago. So we've seen God expounding on the folly of arrogant greed. We've seen God's 4 woes against the oppressors. Now we're going to look at the folly of idol worship, verses 18 through 20. And God says, "What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols." Now these are all very logical questions for the idolater to consider. Okay, idolater, people who might look at an idol or want to worship an idol, what benefit is there? What profit do you gain from this? An idol cannot provide any benefit to those who worship it. So that leads the question, why would people worship something that doesn't provide them a benefit? Well, he goes on, he says, "Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, 'Awake,' to a mute stone, 'Arise,' and that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside of it." So they're making these idols, and they're saying, "Hey, arise, do something." Well, again, why? Why would people do that? Well, part of the draw of idolatry is that a person can claim it told them whatever they wanted to hear. "Oh yeah, my God told me I get to have 15 wives and you can't say anything about it. Oh yeah, my God said that if you disagree with me, I get to kill you. Oh yeah, my God told me that you need to give me all your stuff." They can say the idol told them to do whatever they want to do. Now, that means that they are essentially taught by their own desires. They're taught by themselves. Now, this brings up a very salient point for our modern day. Because while many people today don't say, "Yes, I'm following whatever idol," people today, well, they want to follow their own desires as well. "Oh, my worldview, my ideology says I can be a woman if I was born a man. I can have as many sexual partners as I want. I can steal your stuff because somehow you are generationally worse than I am," or whatever it may be. And they end up being taught by their own desires. Even though in America, idol worship isn't as popular as it was in Habakkuk's day in their region, people are doing the exact same things today. But notice here the contrast. "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him." Right there. Idols are nothing, but the one true God is alive and active. An idol is just a piece of stone or wood overlaid with gold, but God is alive in his holy temple. He is active, and he will avenge. So in this vision, God has effectively answered all of Habakkuk's complaints, while also demonstrating why the wicked Jews would be punished. Because again, almost everything that God condemns the Babylonians for, the sinful Jews were also involved in. So why does God allow injustice? Why does God allow the wicked to punish the righteous? Well, God has essentially said he gives people free will. They make their choices, but their choices have consequences. And God will punish wrongdoers. So today, as we've been going through this sermon entitled "Stand and See," we've seen God's discussion about the folly of arrogant greed. We've seen God stating 4 woes against oppressors, and we've seen God demonstrating the folly of worshiping idols. Now for today, each of us, well, we must make sure that we don't fall into one of the categories describing oppressors. Now I know none of us would look at ourselves and say, like, "Hey, I'm an oppressor." But we need to take an honest look at ourselves and say, okay, do I harm others? Is there something that I do that causes damage to others? And we need to change those things in our lives. It doesn't matter our reasoning. It doesn't matter how arrogantly we say, "I want this." If we're harming others with our actions, that needs to change. But also, trust God's judgment, trust God's justice to punish the oppressors. Maybe you're in a situation where you've been oppressed, where you've been abused or mistreated, and the temptation may be to lash out, to rise up and strike back. Well, trust God's justice to punish the oppressors. Because what often happens is in our zeal to punish our oppressors, we ourselves become oppressors. The abused often become abusers, and we don't want to let that happen. Trust God's justice to punish the oppressors, and we ourselves don't engage in things that cause harm to others. Now today, as we're closing out our sermon time, maybe you have a need. Maybe there's something in your life where you realize that you need to trust God more. Or maybe you need prayers of support from the congregation, or maybe you have some sin that you need to repent of. We as the congregation want to be here for you. And if perhaps you're with us and you are ready to take the step to become a Christian, maybe you want to learn more about salvation, or maybe you're ready to be baptized, the invitation is also for you. So whatever your need may be, please let it be known as Richard leads us in this invitation song.